The scent of rain-soaked earth and decay clung to Silwen's worn dress. It was the smell of the Omega Quarter, a place where hope, much like the weak autumn sun, struggled to break through the oppressive gray. She clutched the small, calloused hands of her twin daughters, Elindra and Netheris, their bright eyes the only stars in her perpetually twilight world. Here, on the fringe of the Blood Moon Pack, she was less than a shadow. She was a cautionary tale whispered by mothers to their fertile daughters. She had once been Lord Osvarn's chosen mate. She had been praised for her gentle nature, her wide, hopeful eyes. Then she had failed. She had given him daughters. 2 of them. In a pack that worshipped strength and prized male heirs above all else, she had offered only liabilities. Osvarn's praise had curdled into scorn, his touch into blows. He had cast her out, marking her as a Baron Omega, a cruel, inaccurate title that served his pride, and tossed her into this hovel to rot. "Mama, are you cold?" Elindra's small voice was a fragile melody against the harsh wind. Silwen pulled her thin shawl tighter around her children's shoulders, ignoring the shiver that traced its way down her own spine. "No, my loves, I am perfectly warm with you beside me." It was a lie, one of many she told to shield them from the bitterness of their existence. She was always cold. It was a cold that had settled deep in her bones the day Osvarn had backhanded her in front of the entire pack, her daughters wailing at her feet, and declared her useless. Her only solace was a secret, a small magic she barely understood. Where her hands lingered, life seemed to cling a little more stubbornly. The pot of herbs on their windowsill, meant to have withered weeks ago, still sprouted defiant green leaves. Her daughters, despite their meager rations, were vibrant and healthy, their laughter a stark contrast to the hollow-eyed weariness of the other outcasts. It was a soft power, a nurturing touch in a world that valued only the power to break and conquer. It was utterly, hopelessly worthless. A commotion from the center of the settlement shattered the quiet misery of the morning. Shouts and the heavy, rhythmic tread of armored paws echoed through the muddy laneways. Fear, sharp and metallic, spiked the air. This was not the familiar cruelty of the pack enforcers. This was something else, something foreign and immense. "Stay behind me," Silwen whispered, pulling her girls tight against her legs. She peered around the corner of their shack, her heart hammering against her ribs. The pack was assembled in the main clearing, their usual arrogance replaced by a tense, fearful submission. Even Lord Osvarn, his broad shoulders hunched, looked small. Dominating the clearing was a figure cloaked in shadows and silence. He was massive, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, his fur the color of a starless midnight. An aura of ancient power and profound cold radiated from him, making the very air seem to thin and crackle. This was the Alpha King, Morvain of the Shadowfang Dominion, a name that was a curse on the lips of his enemies and a prayer on the lips of his subjects. His lands were said to be vast, his armies invincible, and his heart a shard of ice. Legends claimed his touch withered life, that his kingdom was a blighted wasteland that mirrored the decay in his soul. He had come to collect the biannual tribute. "Lord Osvarn!" The king's voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep within the earth. It held no warmth, only the crushing weight of absolute authority. "Your offering of gold and grain is adequate, but I find myself in need of something more. Something living?" A collective gasp rippled through the pack. A living tribute? It was unheard of. It meant a sacrifice. Osvarn paled, his eyes darting around his pack, searching for a worthy yet expendable offering. Silwen's blood ran cold. She knew that calculating look. She had seen it 1,000 times, right before his hand had struck. His gaze swept past the terrified families, past the strong warriors and the fertile she-wolves. Then his eyes landed on her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, a mask of salvation and malice. He had found his perfect offering, a useless Omega and her 2 worthless daughters. A tribute that would cost him nothing and rid him of a public shame. "Alpha King!" Osvarn boomed, his confidence returning. "We have a most unique offering for you, a symbol of our pack's resilience." He gestured toward Silwen. "This is Silwen, an Omega of rare fortitude, and her offspring." 2 of Osvarn's guards shoved their way through the crowd, their hands grabbing Silwen's arms. She cried out, more in fear for her daughters than for herself. They were wrenched from her side, their small cries piercing her heart. She was dragged forward, stumbling in the mud, and thrown at the feet of the Shadow King. She landed hard, the damp earth cold against her cheek. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and suffocating. This was it. This was the end. Her only regret was that her daughters would have to watch. Silwen forced herself to lift her head, defiance a flickering ember in the storm of her fear. She would not cower, not in front of the man who had broken her, and not in front of the monster who would end her. Her eyes met the Alpha King's, and the world seemed to fall away. They were not the cold, dead eyes of a tyrant she had expected. They were the color of molten gold, shot through with veins of shadow, and they held a weariness so profound it seemed to pull at the very air around him. Power radiated from him, yes, but it was a lonely, desolate power. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her torn dress and the fading bruises on her arms, and for a fleeting moment she saw not contempt, but a flicker of something else. Recognition? No, that was impossible. It was more like curiosity. "She has borne you no sons," King Morvayn stated, his voice flat. It was not a question. His golden eyes flickered to Osvarn, a subtle challenge in their depths. Osvarn puffed out his chest. "She is defective, my king, but her bloodline is old. Perhaps her resilience will be of some service to you." The lie was slick and practiced. He was framing his cruelty as a gift. Morvayn's gaze returned to Silwen, then shifted to where the guards held her trembling daughters. Elindra was clutching a small, purple wildflower she must have plucked from the edge of the woods that morning. It was her favorite kind, a stubborn little bloom that grew where nothing else would. The Alpha King moved, his steps silent and deliberate. The pack held its breath. He stopped before her daughters, his immense shadow falling over them. He was a mountain of dark fur and muscle, a creature of nightmare. Netheris hid her face in the guard's leg, but Elindra, ever the brave one, stared up at him, her chin wobbling as she clutched her flower like a talisman. He knelt, a slow, creaking motion, bringing himself closer to their level. The gesture was so unexpected, it sent another ripple of shock through the crowd. Kings did not kneel, especially not for the cast-off children of an Omega. He extended a hand, his long black claws carefully retracted toward Elindra. He did not try to touch her, but gestured toward the flower. "What is this?" he rumbled, his voice softer now, though no less intimidating. "A star petal," Elindra whispered, her voice barely audible. As his hand drew near, the vibrant purple petals of the flower began to curl inward. The green stem turned a sickly brown, and the bloom shriveled, turning to gray dust before it even touched his skin. It happened in an instant, a small, silent death. A collective gasp went through the pack. Black magic. A curse. The whispers started, venomous and fearful. But Silwen saw something else. She saw the flash of raw, agonizing pain in the king's golden eyes. It was a look of self-loathing so intense it was like a physical blow. He snatched his hand back as if burned, his fist clenching at his side. The mask of cold indifference slammed back into place, but she had seen it. The crack in the armor. This feared king, this monster. He was wounded. He rose to his full height, turning his back on the dead flower and the terrified child. His aura of coldness intensified, a shield against the prying eyes of the world. "I accept your tribute," he declared, his voice once again the iron fist of command. He looked at Osvarn, and for the first time, Silwen saw true menace in his expression. "They will be taken to my fortress, and you, Lord Osvarn, will remember that what belongs to me is under my protection, even the things you discard." The threat was clear and sharp. Osvarn's face tightened, his victory souring into unease. He had meant to be rid of a problem, but he may have just handed his enemy a weapon. Morvaine's guards, clad in black armor that seemed to drink the light, moved forward. They were efficient and impersonal. They released her daughters, who immediately scrambled to her side, and then two of the guards flanked her, their presence a cage of steel. "Mama!" Nethera sobbed, burying her face in Silwen's dress. Silwen wrapped her arms around them, whispering soothing words she did not feel. She was being taken from the only world she had ever known, a world of pain and humiliation, and delivered into the hands of a cursed king who killed flowers with his very presence. She had no idea if this was a death sentence or a reprieve. She only knew that as she was led away, the weight of King Morvaine's golden eyes followed her, filled with a desolate hunger she could not begin to comprehend. The journey to the Shadowfang Dominion was a blur of gray landscapes and oppressive silence. The king's fortress rose from the blighted land like a shard of obsidian, a jagged peak of black stone that clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. Not a single tree bore leaves, not a blade of grass grew near its walls. The earth itself seemed to have surrendered to despair. Silwen had expected a dungeon, a cold cell where they would be forgotten. Instead, they were led to a suite of rooms high in one of the castle's towers. The chambers were vast and surprisingly comfortable, furnished with dark wood and rich, albeit colorless, tapestries. A fire crackled in the hearth, a lonely point of warmth in the immense cold of the castle. But the windows were barred with intricate ironwork, and the heavy door was locked from the outside. It was a gilded cage. Days bled into one another. Servants, silent and spectral, brought them food and water, their eyes always downcast. They never spoke to her. The king remained unseen. The silence was a living thing, pressing in on her, broken only by the whispers and songs she shared with her daughters. To keep their spirits up, and her own, she created a small garden on their windowsill, using old crates and soil begged from a kitchen servant. She planted the seeds from their meager fruit rations, humming old lullabies and pouring her desperate hope into the soil. To her quiet amazement, they sprouted. Tiny, vibrant green shoots pushed their way through the dark earth, a splash of impossible color in the monochrome world of the Shadow King. Her daughters were delighted, spending hours watching the small leaves unfurl. It was a tiny act of defiance, a testament to a life that refused to be extinguished. One evening, the heavy oak door creaked open. Silwen immediately stood, pushing Elindra and Netheris behind her. King Morvaine filled the doorway, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. He was not in his formidable wolf form, but stood as a man, tall and powerfully built, dressed in simple black. His long dark hair was tied back, revealing the harsh, handsome planes of his face. His golden eyes, intense and searching, landed on the windowsill. He walked toward it, his boots silent on the stone floor. He stopped before the small, thriving plants, his expression unreadable. He did not reach for them, he knew better. "Nothing has grown within these walls for a century," he said, his voice a low murmur. He was not looking at her, but at the small, green leaves basking in the faint light. How? Silwen's heart pounded. Was this a transgression? Would he destroy her small island of life? I do not know, Your Majesty. I only planted the seeds." He finally turned to look at her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "The servants call you the sun-kissed Omega. They say you have brought a fragment of light into this forsaken place." She flinched at the title. Another label, another box to be put in. "I have no such power, my lord." "Do not lie to me," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I saw what happened to the flower, and I see this. There is life in you, a power my curse cannot immediately extinguish. I want to understand it." Fear warred with a strange, burgeoning curiosity. He was not angry. He was intrigued, desperate even. She saw again the deep, aching loneliness in his eyes, the look of a man starved for warmth, for color, for the very life he was cursed to destroy. "Tell me a story," he commanded, the words abrupt. He gestured to a chair by the fire. "Tell me of the green world, the world before the blight." Hesitantly, Silwen sat. Her daughters peeked out from behind her skirts, their fear of the giant man tempered by a childlike wonder. The king did not sit, but stood by the cold stone of the mantelpiece, a sentinel wrapped in shadow. So she spoke. She told him stories her grandmother had told her, tales of the whispering woods of her youth, of sun-drenched meadows filled with starpitals, of ancient oaks with canopies so vast they were like a second sky. She described the scent of damp moss after a spring rain, the feel of cool grass beneath bare feet, the sound of a forest alive with birdsong. She spun worlds of color and light with her words, painting pictures for a man who lived in a world of gray. He listened in absolute silence, his golden eyes fixed on her face. As she spoke, she felt a subtle shift in the room. The oppressive weight of his power seemed to lessen, the profound cold receding just a fraction. It was as if her voice, her memories, were a balm to the gnawing emptiness inside him. He began to visit every evening. It became their ritual. He would stand by the fire, a silent, brooding statue, and she would sit with her daughters curled at her feet, weaving tales of a world he could never touch. She never asked about his curse. He never asked about her past. They existed in this strange limbo, a cursed king and a broken Omega, finding a fragile, unspoken solace in stories of what they had both lost. He started leaving them small things by the door. A book of old legends, a wooden toy horse, crudely carved but smoothed with care. A basket of winter apples, their skins a startling, brilliant red. Small gifts that spoke of a hesitant, awkward gratitude. Silwen found herself watching for his visits, her heart giving a strange flutter when the door swung open. She was a prisoner, he her captor. And yet, in the quiet moments of their shared evenings, surrounded by shadows and stories, she felt more seen, more valued than she ever had as the prized mate of Lord Osvarn. It was a terrifying, confusing feeling. The monster was becoming a man, and his loneliness was beginning to feel dangerously familiar. The relative peace of their strange arrangement was shattered by the arrival of a messenger from the Blood Moon Pack. The man, a grim-faced beta from Morvaine's own guard, delivered the scroll to the king during one of his evening visits. Silwen watched as Morvaine broke the seal, his expression hardening as he read. "It seems your former alpha has grown bold," Morvaine said, his voice laced with a cold fury that made the flames in the hearth sputter. He crumpled the parchment in his fist. "Lord Osvarn sends his concerns. He has heard rumors of my favor and suggests that a defective Omega is an insult to my court. He wishes to reclaim what is his." Silwen's blood ran cold. Reclaim her. The word was a violation, a reminder that to Osvarn she was not a person, but a possession to be used and discarded at will. The thought of his hands on her again, on her daughters, sent a wave of nausea through her. "He cannot," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Morvaine's golden eyes snapped to hers. The fury within them banked, but still burning hot. "He will not. You are under my protection now. He seems to have forgotten that." He tossed the crumpled scroll into the fire, where it blackened and turned to ash. "But his insolence reveals a deeper problem. There are those in my own dominion who share his views. They see you as a weakness, a distraction." His words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of her precarious position. She was not just a prisoner. She was a political pawn, a symbol of the king's inexplicable departure from tradition. From that day on, the atmosphere in the castle shifted. The silent servants now cast furtive, resentful glances her way. Whispers followed her in the rare moments she was allowed to walk the corridor outside her rooms with a guard. The king's visits became shorter, more fraught with tension. The weight of his kingdom and the dissent her presence was causing pressed down on him. One afternoon, a different servant brought their meal. She was an older she-wolf, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. She set the tray down with a clatter, her eyes lingering on the vibrant plants on the windowsill with open disdain. "Unnatural," the woman muttered, just loud enough for Silwen to hear. "The king wastes his time with barren novelties while the dominion withers." The word barren was a physical blow, striking the same old wound Osvarn had carved into her soul. Silwen flinched, pulling her daughters closer. The woman sneered and left, slamming the door behind her. Later that week, the true threat revealed itself. King Morvaine was late for his evening visit. Silwen paced the room, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The girls were already asleep, their small faces peaceful in the firelight. When the door finally opened, Morvaine stumbled in, leaning heavily against the frame. His black tunic was slashed across the ribs, and a dark, viscous fluid, too dark for blood, was seeping through the fabric. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. "Your Majesty!" Silwen gasped, rushing to his side. "Rebels!" he grunted, waving off her attempt to help him. "An ambush in the lower passages. Sympathizers of the old ways. They believe I am weakened." He pushed himself away from the door and staggered toward a chair, sinking into it with a groan. She could see the wound more clearly now. It was not a clean cut. The edges were blackened, necrotic, as if the blade that struck him was poisoned. But she knew it was not poison. It was his own curse, turning a simple wound into a festering, life-devouring rot. His body was attacking itself. "The physicians cannot help," he said, his voice strained. "Their poultices turn to ash when they touch my skin. It will heal, eventually, in a month or two." He tried for a sardonic smile, but it became a grimace of pain. Silwen looked at the decaying wound, at the sheen of cold sweat on his brow, and at the deep lines of agony etching his face. A month? He would be lucky to survive a week. The infection, fed by his own blighted nature, would consume him. And with him would die her only protector, leaving her and her daughters at the mercy of his enemies and of Osvarn. A desperate resolve hardened within her. She thought of her small, thriving plants. She thought of the life that flowed from her fingertips, a power she had always considered useless. Perhaps it was not. "Let me help you," she said, her voice firm. He looked up, his golden eyes clouded with pain. "You cannot. Nothing can. You are wrong." She knelt before him, her fear a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. This was madness. He was the Shadow King. His touch meant death. But seeing him so vulnerable, so broken, she felt not fear, but a powerful, overwhelming urge to soothe, to heal. Before he could protest, before she could lose her nerve, she reached out and gently tore away the ruined fabric of his tunic, exposing the ghastly wound. Then, taking a deep breath, she laid her hands flat against his skin, directly over the blackened flesh. The moment her palms made contact with his skin, two things happened at once. A searing, icy cold shot up her arms, a pain so intense it felt as if her very life force was being siphoned away. It was the feeling of absolute negation, of her warmth being devoured by an ancient, insatiable void. She cried out, her muscles locking in protest. Simultaneously, a brilliant, warm light erupted from her hands, invisible to the eye, but felt as a profound, thrumming energy. It pulsed into Morvaine's body, a direct counter-assault against the creeping decay of his curse. She felt his entire body jolt under her touch, a sharp hiss of breath escaping his lips. It was not a sound of pain, but of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared down at her hands, his golden eyes wide with disbelief. Where her fingers pressed against his skin, the necrotic blackness was receding. Slowly, painstakingly, the dead flesh was giving way to healthy tissue. The sluggish, dark ooze from the wound began to flow red, the color of true, living blood. The rot was being held at bay, beaten back by the stubborn, defiant life that poured from her. It was agony. Every second felt like an hour, the cold of his curse leaching the strength from her bones. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her vision began to swim. She felt herself weakening, the flow of her energy faltering. But she held on, fueled by a desperate, wild hope. She would not let this man die. She would not let her daughters be orphaned in this desolate land. "Enough!" Morvaine's voice was a raw, strangled command. He grabbed her wrists, his touch surprisingly gentle, and pulled her hands away from the wound. The connection broke. Silwen gasped, slumping to the floor, panting for breath. The strength had gone out of her limbs, leaving her trembling and utterly spent. But the cold was gone, replaced by the familiar warmth of her own life. She looked up at him. The wound was no longer a festering pit of decay. It was still a deep, grievous cut, but it was clean. It was a wound that could heal. The curse's hold had been broken. Morvaine stared at the place she had touched, then at her, his expression a maelstrom of emotions she could not decipher. Awe, confusion, fear, and something else, something tender and dangerously vulnerable. "What are you?" he whispered, the words filled with a reverence that stole her breath. "I am Silwen," she managed to say, her voice shaking. He reached out, his hand hesitating in the air between them, before his fingers gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was not cold. For the first time, it was warm, a faint, hesitant warmth, like the first rays of sun after a long winter. But it was there. The contact sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. In that moment, something ancient and powerful clicked into place between them. A bond, suppressed and ignored by him for his entire cursed life, flared into existence, roaring through her veins like a river of fire. It was a feeling of homecoming, of rightness, of two fractured souls recognizing their missing piece. The mate bond. It was undeniable, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. He felt it too. She saw it in the sudden, sharp intake of his breath, in the way his golden eyes darkened with a possessive primal fire. All the loneliness, all the pain and isolation he had carried for centuries, coalesced into a single, desperate need. For her. "Mine," he growled, the word a promise and a claim. It vibrated through the very stones of the castle. He knelt before her, his previous pain seemingly forgotten. He framed her face with his hands, his gaze searching hers, looking for something, for everything. "My entire life," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I have been a blight, a walking plague. My touch brings decay. My presence withers the land. It is a curse passed down my bloodline for generations. It is why my kingdom is dying. It is why I can never have an heir, never know the touch of another without bringing them pain and death." His confession poured out of him, the desperate words of a man who had been silent for too long. "But you touch me, and you bring life. Your very presence makes things grow. You are the absolute antithesis to my existence. You are my cure." Tears welled in Silwen's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a profound, shattering empathy. The feared Shadow King was not a monster. He was a prisoner, trapped in a cage of his own cursed flesh. "You are not a blight," she whispered, her own hand rising to touch his cheek. He flinched instinctively, but did not pull away. His skin was warm beneath her palm. "You are Morvain." The use of his name, without a title, without fear, seemed to break something within him. A single, crystalline tear traced a path down his rugged cheek. It was a tear for a century of solitude, for a lifetime of untouchable longing. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing, a broken king finally finding his salvation in the hands of a cast-off Omega. The rebellion, the kingdom, the threat of Osvarn, it all faded away, leaving only the two of them in the firelight, bound by a fate far more powerful than any curse. The revelation of their bond changed everything. The tentative space they had carved out with stories and silent observation was now charged with an electric, undeniable intimacy. Morvain's wound, free from the grip of his curse, began to heal at a rapid pace, a visible testament to her power. And he, in turn, no longer held himself apart. He moved them from the tower suite to his own royal chambers, a vast expanse of rooms adjoining his personal study and library. He declared them under his direct and personal protection, a decree that sent shockwaves through the court. The whispers did not cease, but they were now tinged with awe and fear, rather than mere contempt. The sun-kissed Omega had healed the unhealable king. She was no longer a novelty. She was a miracle, or a witch. The court was divided on which. For Silwen, it was a disorienting new reality. She was no longer a prisoner, but she was not yet a queen. She was his. The bond hummed between them constantly, a low thrum of awareness that made her acutely sensitive to his presence, his moods. When he was near, a sense of rightness settled over her. When he was gone, a phantom ache resided in her chest. He showed her a side of himself no one else had ever seen. The cold, ruthless king was replaced by a man of quiet intensity and a surprisingly gentle nature. He would watch her tend to her ever-expanding collection of plants, which now graced every windowsill in their chambers, his expression one of profound wonder. He played with her daughters, letting them braid starpedals into his dark hair, a sight so surreal it brought tears to Sylwen's eyes. He was cautious, always, terrified of his curse reasserting itself, but the warmth in his touch was growing stronger each day. One evening, he led her to the castle's highest balcony. Below them, the blighted lands of the Shadowfang Dominion stretched out to the horizon, a tapestry of gray and brown under a bruised twilight sky. "This is my failure," he said, his voice quiet. "For generations, my ancestors ruled a green and fertile land. But the curse grew stronger with each passing king. With me, it has reached its apex. The land dies because I live." "It is not your failure," Sylwen said, standing beside him. She resisted the urge to take his hand, the publicness of the balcony still a barrier. "It is a sickness, and sickness can be cured." He turned to her, a sliver of hope warring with a lifetime of despair in his golden eyes. "You are my only hope, Sylwen, but the whispers in the court are growing louder. Lord Osvarn has been sending emissaries to my restless vassals, stoking their fears. He paints you as a sorceress who has enchanted me, a weakness that will be the final death knell of this kingdom. He is rallying them." The name Osvarn was a shard of ice in her heart. She had foolishly begun to believe she was free of him, that his shadow could not reach her here. "What will you do?" "I will not hide you away," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I will not treat you as a secret or a shame. You are my mate, my queen. It is time the entire Dominion knew it." He looked out at the dying land. "There is to be a formal coronation ceremony in 3 days. I will present you to the court and the assembled lords as my Luna Queen. We will face them together." The thought terrified her. To stand before a court of resentful, fearful wolves, to be judged and measured by their cruel standards, was a nightmare. She was Sylwen, the Baron Omega, the outcast. How could she be a queen? Sensing her fear through the bond, Morvaine's focus softened. He shifted, his body creating a barrier between her and the vast empty landscape, making the world feel smaller, safer. "You healed a king that healers have abandoned for a century. You bring life where there is only death. You have more strength in your gentle heart than any of those armored brutes have in their entire bodies. You were born to be a queen." His faith in her was a staggering, humbling thing. He saw not the Omega Osvarn had shamed, but the woman who had saved him. Looking into his earnest, hopeful eyes, Sylwen felt a flicker of that same belief ignite within herself. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps her soft power was not a weakness, but a different kind of strength, one this broken land desperately needed. "Together," she agreed, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. His smile was a rare and beautiful thing, transforming his harsh features into something breathtakingly handsome. It reached his eyes, chasing the shadows from their golden depths. In that moment, standing on a high balcony overlooking a dead kingdom, Sylwen did not feel like an outcast. She felt like a woman standing on the precipice of a new world, with her king, her mate, by her side. But she could not shake the feeling that Osvarn's shadow was lengthening, and that their public declaration would not be a resolution, but an invitation to war. The throne room was a cavern of black marble and cold silence, built to intimidate and awe. Today it was filled with the assembled vassals of the Shadowfang Dominion, a grim collection of alphas and betas whose faces were carved from stone and suspicion. They stood in rigid formation, their armor gleaming dully in the light of the high, narrow windows. The air was thick with tension, a palpable cloud of resentment and fear. Sylwen stood beside the throne, Morvaine's hand a warm, solid presence at the small of her back. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, a color he had chosen, that shimmered with threads of silver like a star-strewn sky. It was more beautiful than anything she had ever owned, but it felt like a costume. Beneath the fine silk, her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Elindra and Netheris stood near the dais with Adric, Morvaine's loyal and stoic Beta, their small hands clutching his armored leg. "Lords of the Dominion!" Morvaine's voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls, imbued with the absolute power of an Alpha King. "You have been summoned to bear witness. For too long, our lands have suffered. For too long, our people have lived under the shadow of a curse that has drained the life from our home and our hope." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the stern faces of his vassals. "But the long night is ending. A new dawn has come to the Shadowfang. Fate has brought me my mate, my salvation." He turned to her, and the raw adoration in his eyes was so potent it made her forget the hostile crowd. He took her hand, his touch sending a wave of warmth and strength through her. He raised it for all to see. "I present to you, Sylwen, of the sun-kissed soul. She is the harbinger of life, the healer of our blighted lands. She is my mate, my equal, and your Luna Queen." A stunned, heavy silence fell over the throne room. It was not the reaction Morvaine had hoped for. The lords exchanged dark, troubled glances. A queen who was not of a noble bloodline? A cast-off Omega from a minor pack? It was a breach of every tradition they held sacred. A lord at the front, a grizzled old wolf named Lord Iltheron with a face like a knotted oak, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we rejoice in any hope for the kingdom. But this is irregular. The woman is an Omega. She was cast out for being barren." "Barren?" Morvaine's laugh was a dangerous, rumbling sound. He gestured to Elindra and Netheris. "Does she look barren to you, my lord? Or did her former alpha simply lack the strength to sire a worthy heir?" The insult was direct and sharp, a challenge to the patriarchal beliefs they all held dear. Before Lord Iltheron could retort, the great doors of the throne room were flung open with a deafening crash. All heads turned. Lord Osvarn strode into the hall as if he owned it. He was flanked by a dozen of his most brutal warriors, but more alarmingly, several of Morvaine's own discontented lords fell in step behind him. He had not just come to protest. He had come with an army at his back. "A touching fairy tale, Morvaine," Osvarn called out, his voice slick with mockery. He stopped in the center of the hall, his eyes locking on Sylwen. His gaze was possessive, filled with a renewed hunger that made her skin crawl. "But you have been deceived. This is no savior. This is a common Omega, my property, who has clearly bewitched you with some sort of pathetic hedge magic." "She is my queen, Osvarn," Morvaine growled, stepping in front of Sylwen protectively. "You have no claim here. Leave now, and I may let you keep your miserable life." "I think not." Osvarn drew his sword, its polished steel gleaming. His men and the traitorous lords did the same. "You have grown weak, old friend, doting on a barren Omega while your kingdom crumbles. Your vassals are tired of a king who brings only death. They yearn for a leader who brings strength." He smirked. "I am here to reclaim my property and to relieve you of the burden of your crown." It was a coup, a blatant, violent grab for power staged in the heart of the kingdom. Morvaine's royal guards moved to form a defensive circle around the dais, but they were outnumbered. The throne room was a tinderbox, ready to explode into a bloodbath. Osvarn's eyes fixed on Elindra and Netheris, who were whimpering in fear behind Aedric. A vile, opportunistic idea lit his face. "And I will take my daughters as well. They may yet be traded for a useful alliance, something their mother could never provide." That was the final straw. The threat to her children shattered Silwen's fear, replacing it with a cold, pure rage. This man would not touch them. He would not use them. He would not harm anyone in her new life ever again. But as the two sides prepared to charge, Osvarn revealed his trump card. One of the traitor lords suddenly grabbed Elindra, holding a dagger to her throat. Another seized Netheris. "Mama!" they screamed, their terrified cries echoing in the tense silence. The world stopped. Morvain froze, his face a mask of horrified fury. Aedric let out a roar of rage, but could not move without endangering the children. Osvarn smiled, a triumphant, wicked expression on his face. He had them. "Now, Morvain," Osvarn said, his voice dripping with victory. "You will stand down, and you, Silwen, will come to me, or the brats die." Time seemed to stretch and thin, every heartbeat a deafening drum in the suffocating silence. Silwen saw only her daughters, their small faces streaked with tears, the cold steel of the daggers pressed against their fragile skin. Every instinct screamed at her to obey, to trade herself for their lives. But she looked at Morvain and saw the absolute agony in his eyes. He was trapped. If he unleashed his full power, the destructive force of his curse, he could annihilate Osvarn and his men in a heartbeat. But it was an indiscriminate power, a wave of pure entropy. It would kill the traitors, but it would also kill the children, the loyal guards, and everyone else in the room. To save his newfound family, he would have to become the monster everyone believed him to be, and he would lose them anyway. Osvarn savored the moment, his eyes locked on Silwen, certain of his victory. "Come now, Silwen, back to your rightful place." Rightful place. On her knees, beaten and broken, a vessel for his ambition and cruelty. Never again. Something inside her shifted. The rage did not cool. It clarified. It became a channel for her power, a power she was only just beginning to understand. It was not a weapon of destruction, but its opposite. And in a hall made of dead stone, in a kingdom dying of accursed blight, life was the most powerful weapon of all. She looked at Morvain, her gaze conveying a message that transcended words. "Trust me." He saw it. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the sheer force of her will, and in a monumental act of faith, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He would not use his power. He would trust in hers. He turned his full attention to Osvarn, deliberately drawing the usurper's focus. "You think this is about strength, Osvarn? Your strength is a hollow thing. It is the power to break, to take, to destroy. You are a parasite. You are the blight." While Osvarn bristled at the insult, his ego pricked. Silwen closed her eyes and reached inward. She drew upon the well of life within her, the same energy she used to nurture seeds into saplings, the same power that had knit Morvain's flesh back together. But this time, she did not focus it on a single point. She let it flow out of her, not as a trickle, but as a flood. The black marble floor beneath her feet began to glow with a soft green light. The energy surged outward, a silent, invisible wave of pure vitality. It was not violent. It was pervasive. It touched the cold, dead stone of the castle, and for the first time in a century, it awoke the dormant life trapped within. Thin green vines, vibrant and alive, snaked out of the cracks between the flagstones. They grew with astonishing speed, thick and strong, wrapping around the legs of Osvarn's men. The traders cried out in shock, stumbling as their feet were ensnared. The man holding Elindra gasped as a thorny vine coiled around his dagger arm, forcing him to drop the blade. Another vine, gently but firmly, wrapped around the arm of the man holding Nithyrus, pushing the knife away from her throat. The stone walls themselves seemed to sigh. Moss and tiny star-like flowers erupted from the mortar. The air, once stale and cold, filled with the rich, loamy scent of a forest floor. It was not an attack, it was a reclamation. Life was retaking its dominion from the shadows. Osvarn stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. "What is this sorcery?" he shrieked, hacking at the vines around his feet with his sword, but 2 more grew for every one he severed. With his men entangled and his hostages freed, the tide turned in an instant. Aedric moved like a blur, snatching Elindra and Nithyrus and pulling them back to safety. Morvaine's royal guards, no longer held back, descended upon the trapped and terrified rebels. But Morvaine had eyes only for Osvarn. Freed from the choice of using his curse, invigorated by the wave of life that washed over the room and soothed the ache in his own soul, Morvaine moved. He was not a lumbering monster, but a blur of focused, deadly grace. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Osvarn, panicked, swung his sword wildly. Morvaine didn't even bother to draw his own weapon. He caught Osvarn's sword wrist in one hand, the sound of snapping bone echoing sharply in the hall. Osvarn screamed, the sword clattering to the floor. Morvaine's other hand clamped around his throat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. "You are right about one thing," Morvaine rasped, his golden eyes blazing with righteous fury, his face inches from the terrified usurper. "The king does bring death." He squeezed, and Osvarn's struggles weakened, his face turning a dark purple. "But only to those who threaten his queen." He did not kill him. With a final look of utter contempt, he hurled Osvarn's broken body into the mass of his captured men. The coup was over. The throne room was silent, save for the panting of captured men and the soft, rustling sound of living vines. The assembled lords, both loyal and wavering, stared at Silwen, who stood amidst the impossible greenery, her chest heaving with exertion. They were no longer looking at a barren Omega. They were looking at a force of nature. They were looking at their queen. In the aftermath of the failed coup, a profound and lasting change settled over the Shadowfang dominion. The throne room, now permanently entwined with living flowering vines, became a symbol of the new era. The story of the Luna Queen, who commanded life itself, spread like wildfire, first through the castle, then to the city, and finally to the farthest reaches of the kingdom. Fear of her power was quickly replaced by reverence. She was not a witch. She was a blessing. Osvarn and the traitorous lords were imprisoned, their fate a stark warning against challenging the new order. But Morvaine, guided by Silwen's counsel, chose not to rule through fear. The traitors were given a choice: exile or a lifetime of servitude, rebuilding the lands they had been willing to let die. Most chose servitude, their arrogance broken, their belief systems shattered by what they had witnessed. With the political threat neutralized, the true work began. Silwen's power, amplified and stabilized by the full acceptance of her bond with Morvaine, was no longer confined to small plants on a windowsill. Together, they walked the dead lands surrounding the castle. Where she walked, the soil stirred. Where he stood beside her, his curse now a muted echo instead of a raging storm, the land did not wither. She would place her hands upon the gray earth, and he would place his over hers. Their combined energies, the perfect balance of shadow and light, creation and destruction held in check, flowed into the ground. It was a slow, arduous process. They started with a small garden within the castle walls, which soon exploded into a riot of color and life. Then they moved to the fields just outside the gates. For the first time in generations, green shoots of wheat pushed through the soil of the Shadowfang dominion. The people, once grim and hopeless, began to celebrate. They brought her seeds from ancient forgotten stores. They sang songs of the sun-kissed queen. Her daughters, no longer objects of scorn, were beloved princesses, their laughter echoing through halls that had known only silence. They would run through the newly green gardens, chasing butterflies that had miraculously appeared, a sight that brought both Silwen and Morvain a deep soul-healing joy. One evening, months after the confrontation, Morvain led her back to the high balcony. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Below them, the landscape was no longer a uniform gray. Patches of vibrant green were spreading outward from the castle, a slow, determined wave of life pushing back the blight. "I never believed I would see this again," Morvain said, his voice thick with emotion. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. His touch was completely warm now, a comforting, solid presence. "You have not just saved me, Silwen. You have saved us all." She leaned her head back against his shoulder, content in his embrace. "We saved us all. Your faith in me, it was the key. My love for you was the key." He corrected her gently, pressing a kiss to her temple. Faith was simply the consequence of that love. The mate bond between them was a constant, steady hum of affection and deep, unconditional acceptance. He had seen her at her lowest, and she had seen him at his most broken. There were no secrets, no walls between them. She was no longer just his mate, or his queen. She was his partner in every sense of the word. His counsel now sought her opinion on matters of agriculture and community, her innate understanding of nurturing and growth proving just as valuable as Morvain's centuries of strategic knowledge. She felt a sudden wave of dizziness and leaned more heavily against him, one hand instinctively going to her stomach. Morvain stiffened, his senses finely attuned to her through the bond, picking up on the subtle change in her body. "Silwen, are you all right?" A slow, wondrous smile spread across her face. It was a feeling she had not had in years, but one she recognized instantly. It was the faint, fluttering whisper of a new life, a new beginning. She turned in his arms, her eyes shining with tears of joy. She took his large, calloused hand and placed it on her still flat abdomen. "The blight is not just gone from the land, my love," she whispered. He stilled, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes widened as the realization dawned, as he felt the faint, miraculous spark of life through their bond, a life that was a part of him, a part of her, a life that should have been impossible. His curse had not just been healed, it had been utterly and completely erased. His carefully constructed composure shattered. He let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob, sweeping her up in his arms and burying his face in her hair. He was going to be a father. The Shadow King, the last of a cursed line, would have an heir. His kingdom had a future. His family had a future. Their love had not just healed the past, it had created a new one. The news of the Queen's pregnancy sent a wave of unadulterated joy through the Dominion. It was the final, undeniable proof that the curse was broken and a new age had begun. The once feared Shadowfang Kingdom became a place of pilgrimage for scholars and healers, all eager to study the miraculous revitalization of the land. Silwen, the once scorned Omega, was now revered, her story a legend told at every hearth. Her pregnancy progressed easily, a stark contrast to the difficult, stressful time she had endured carrying Elindra and Netheris under Osvarn's cruel watch. Here she was cherished. Morvain was a doting, almost comically overprotective mate. He catered to her every craving, insisted on carrying her up flights of stairs, and read ancient histories to their unborn child every night, his deep rumble a soothing presence against her belly. Elindra and Netheris were ecstatic. They would press their ears to their mother's stomach, giggling at the faint kicks from their future sibling. They were no longer the useless daughters of a barren Omega. They were princesses, confident and loved, their days filled with lessons from Morvain's finest tutors and adventures in the flourishing royal gardens. They were healing from their traumatic early years, their laughter the sweetest music in the castle. As her time grew near, Morvain's anxiety mounted. He had Adric, his ever-loyal Beta, triple the guard around the royal chambers and personally interviewed every midwife and physician in the kingdom. "Morvain, my love," Silwen said one evening, taking his restless hands in hers. "Everything will be fine. This child is a symbol of life, not fear. I have spent centuries bringing only the opposite," he confessed, his golden eyes shadowed with the memory of his past. "The fear is not for you or the child. It is for myself. I am terrified of failing you, of not being the father this child deserves." "Look at Elindra and Netheris," she said softly. "You are already the father they deserve. You taught them to be brave. You showed them that a man's strength is in his kindness, not his cruelty. You healed their hearts, Morvain, just as I healed your wound." His fears assuaged, he knelt and pressed a gentle kiss to her swollen belly. "Our son will be a prince of a green kingdom. He will never know the blight." When the time came, the labor was long but filled with support and love. Morvain refused to leave her side, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, his strength a steady anchor in the sea of pain. Finally, with the first light of dawn streaming through the windows, a healthy, robust cry echoed through the chambers. The midwife, her face beaming, wrapped the newborn in a soft blanket and handed him to Silwen. He was perfect. He had a shock of his father's dark hair, and when he opened his eyes, they were the same molten gold. But there was no shadow in them, no hint of the ancient curse. There was only the pure, innocent light of a new life. Silwen looked at Morvain, her heart so full it felt it might burst. His face was a study in awe and love, tears streaming unashamedly down his cheeks as he looked at his son. He gently reached out a finger, stroking the baby's soft cheek. The infant instinctively grasped it, his tiny hand wrapping around the king's finger. The touch was warm, living, and real. The cycle of pain was broken. "What shall we name him?" Morvain whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Silwen smiled, her own eyes wet with tears. "Meloris," she said. "It means little fire. The little fire that brought the dawn." Morvain leaned down and kissed her, a kiss filled with gratitude, love, and the promise of 1,000 happy tomorrows. Then he kissed his son's forehead. He was no longer Morvain, the Shadow King, the last of a cursed line. He was Morvain, Alpha King, beloved mate, and father. He was whole. The union was complete, the bond solidified not just by fate and a public ceremony, but by the creation of a new, blessed life. Their reign, the reign of the Alpha and the Omega, the shadow and the sun, had truly begun. 1 year later, the kingdom was unrecognizable. The name Shadowfang was now spoken only in histories, a relic of a bygone era. The people now called it the Verdant Dominion, a land of rolling green hills, lush forests, and fields heavy with golden wheat. The castle of black stone was now draped in flowering ivy and climbing roses, its towers reaching toward a clear blue sky. Queen Silwen stood on the high balcony, her son, Meloris, balanced on her hip. He was a sturdy toddler with his father's serious golden eyes and her own gentle smile. He babbled happily, pointing a chubby finger at a butterfly that fluttered past. Beside her, Elindra and Nitharis, now blossoming young girls, were weaving crowns from the star petals that grew in abundance in the balcony planters. The sound of heavy boots on stone announced the arrival of the king. Morvain strode onto the balcony, his formal black tunic replaced by a simple, comfortable linen shirt. The lines of ancient pain were gone from his face, replaced by the easy confidence of a happy, beloved man. He came to Silwen's side, wrapping an arm around her waist and dropping a kiss on Meloris's dark hair. "Look at them," Morvain murmured, his gaze sweeping over his daughters, then his son, and finally settling on his mate. "Our family." "Our kingdom?" Silwen added, leaning her head against his shoulder. From this vantage point, they could see the people in the city below bustling with peaceful energy. Children played in the new town square, and merchants called out their wares in a dozen different dialects. The Dominion was prosperous, and more importantly, it was happy. Their union had brought more than just an end to a curse. It had transformed their society. The old ways of valuing only brute strength and male heirs had crumbled. Silwen had championed education for all children, boys and girls, and established guilds for healers and artisans. Strength was now measured in resilience, in community, in the ability to nurture and create. Omegas were no longer seen as breeding stock, but as the vital, life-giving heart of the pack. Adric, now Lord Commander of the Verdant Guard, entered the balcony and gave a respectful bow. "Your Majesties, the delegates from the southern packs have arrived. They come seeking an alliance and to learn your methods of crop revitalization." "Tell them we will see them shortly," Morvain said, his eyes still on his family. "And that the first lesson is that a kingdom's greatest resource is not its soil, but its queen." Adric smiled, a rare sight, and retreated. Morvain turned Silwen to face him, his golden eyes soft with a love that had only deepened with every passing day. "Do you remember the day I first saw you, a terrified, defiant woman in the mud, protecting her children? I remember a lonely king who killed flowers," she teased gently, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "And you made them grow again," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude, "in the land and in my heart." He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss that spoke of shared trials and shared triumphs. It was the kiss of two souls who had been broken apart and had found a way to become whole together. Meloris giggled, patting his father's face. Elindra and Nitharis ran to them, holding up their finished flower crowns. Morvain knelt and allowed them to place one on his head, a comical circlet of purple and green on the mighty Alpha King. He placed the other on Silwen's head. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the balcony doors. She saw a woman crowned in flowers, a child in her arms, two beautiful daughters at her side, and a king who adored her. She was no longer Silwen the Baron, the outcast, the broken. She was Silwen, the sun-kissed queen, the mother of the Verdant Dominion, and the beloved mate of the man who had found his salvation in her love. She was home,